Welcome to this session. Our chair was called away suddenly, so we're going to have to chair ourselves. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Harald Atmanspacher, a longtime consciousness researcher over almost non-denumerable a number of fields about consciousness studies. He hails from the ETH, I love to say ETH, in Zurich, and he's going to talk about the role of meaning in dual aspect monism.
So, good morning, everybody. I hope you digested this fantastic dinner last night and all the drinks together with it. Welcome to the morning session this morning. I want to talk about dual aspect monism. Actually, all speakers in this session will, in one way or another, talk about this. And I want to make a little propaganda for a book about dual aspect monism, which has almost exactly the same title as this talk, Dual Aspect Monism and the Deep Structure of Meaning, it's the title, published by my colleague and friend Dean Rickles, who will speak later in this session. So this book is now available as a paperback, so everybody can afford it. In science, we usually work with the interplay of theory and experiment, as you all know, right? An experiment is something like a question that we pose to nature, and nature usually returns us an answer. Sometimes you like the answer, sometimes you may not like it, but it's just there, right? So nature returns an answer, but nature does not prescribe to us which questions to ask. So we are free to ask questions. And if we have a problem that we want to solve and don't know a good question, then we pretty early get stuck with that kind of project. So getting to good questions is really a very important piece of scientific research. Now, good questions, to arrive at good questions, requires thinking. It requires even deep thinking when the questions are big. Consciousness is a real big question, and the mind-body problem that I will talk about is also a really big thing. So we need to have deep thinking and not something that is also called deep learning. So deep thinking is very different from deep learning. And one of the protagonists, a very deep thinker in the history of the mind-body problem has been, you all know the name, René Descartes. Descartes posited two substances of which the world is composed, the mental and the physical in today's parlance. He called it res cogitans and res extensa. And these two substances are all that exists in the world. And of course, this position is today known as Cartesian dualism. It has its problems. And one of the first reactions to Descartes' dualism came up about 50 or 40 years after his publications. And that is now called dual aspect monism. Dual aspect monism avoids both physicalist and idealist intuitions. And the philosophical pioneers, the first one who I want to mention is Spinoza in his Ethics, 1677, and often not really counted as a dual aspect monist is also Schelling, a German philosopher who makes his position most clear in his 1809 freedom essay, which is very worthwhile to reading. It's only 30 pages, so you can do it in an afternoon, and then you know what dual aspect monism is all about. Dual aspect monism is not a monolithic position, it has many variations. One of these variations is often called neutral monism, or also Russellian monism, and the pioneers are Ernst Mach, William James, and Bertrand Russell. We will hear more about William James in the last talk in this session. And in the 20th century, there has been a very interesting kind of twist on dual aspect monism, which came in through physicists, mainly through physicists with strongly philosophical inclinations, let me say. So these are the guys here: Wolfgang Pauli, Carl Jung. Jung is obviously not a physicist. Arthur Eddington, John Wheeler, David Bohm, and Basil Hiley. These 6 figures are the key figures in this book, so if you want to know more about them, you have to read it. Now there are essentially, I want to present dual aspect monism in essentially 2 different modes. One of them is compositional, and the other one will be decompositional. So the compositional mode is characterized by psychophysically neutral elements. So you have elements in the world which are neither mental nor are they physical. So in that respect, they transcend Cartesian dualism, neither mental nor physical. And these psychophysically neutral elements, they can yield mental or physical configurations depending on how they are put together. I show you a quote by Bertrand Russell from his analysis of mind in 1921. He says, "The view that seems to me to reconcile," or actually I should go back to the beginning. On the one hand, he says, many psychologists, originally those of the behaviorist school, tend to adopt what is essentially a materialist position as a matter of method, if not of metaphysics. They make psychology increasingly dependent on physiology and external observation, and tend to think of matter as something much more solid and indubitable than mind. Meanwhile, the physicists, especially Einstein and other exponents of the theory of relativity, have been making matter less and less material. Whoever reads, for instance, Professor Eddington's Space, Time and Gravitation will see that an old-fashioned materialism can receive no support from modern physics. Isn't that interesting? 1921. The view that seems to me to reconcile the materialistic tendency of psychology with the anti-materialistic tendency of physics is the view of William James and the American New Realists, according to which the stuff of the world is neither mental nor material, but a neutral stuff out of which both are constructed. The stuff of which our experience is composed is, in my belief, neither mind nor matter, but something more primitive than either. Neither mind nor matter. It's a negative definition, right? It's almost like a kind of negative theology, if you want. Both mind and matter seem to be composite, and the stuff of which they are compounded lies, in a sense, between the two, in a sense, above them both, like a common ancestor. Bertrand Russell in 1921. Now, the other mode of dual aspect thinking is the one that I would like to call decompositional rather than compositional. In the decompositional mode, you don't start with psychophysically neutral elements like building blocks, stuff like that, but you start with a psychophysically neutral whole, one system, undivided universe in David Bohm's words. And the whole is, again, neither mental nor physical. And if you have a whole, you cannot compose it, of course, you can decompose it. So you can introduce distinctions, then you can split the whole into parts, and one of the distinctions that you can make is the distinction of the mental and the physical. And this is the viewpoint by the figures that I mentioned before. Here you see some photographs of them. In the upper line, there's Wolfgang Pauli on the left, Arthur Eddington in the middle, David Bohm on the right, and the lower line, there's Carl Jung on the left, John Wheeler in the middle, and Basil Hiley on the right. So a cartoonish picture of dual aspect monism is like this. So you have the mental and the physical as aspects, not substances, aspects. And then you ask the question, aspects of what? And then you get the psychophysically neutral domain below the horizontal line. An undivided whole which is neither mental nor physical. This is a negative definition, neither nor, and I hope that in the Q&A session you will ask me whether I have some positive definition as well. So in Bohm's terminology, this is what he calls the implicate order, hollow movement sometimes. In John Wheeler's terminology, we speak about pre-geometry, which already indicates that this domain has no space and no time. You need a pre-geometry to characterize it. The famous smoky dragon, people who know the history of physics a little bit know that this is a term that Wheeler took from Niels Bohr. And the third one is due to Pauli and Jung, the Pauli-Jung conjecture. They talk about archetypes, archetypal patterns that are not mental. They can manifest themselves mentally. And they are not physical, but they can manifest themselves physically. So I have a quote here from Wolfgang Pauli in a letter to Markus Fierz, talking about the archetypes. The ordering and regulating factors in the psychophysically neutral domain must be placed beyond the distinction of physical and psychic or psychological, as Plato's ideas share the notion of a concept and of a force of nature. I am very much in favor of referring to the ordering and regulating factors in terms of archetypes, but then it would be inadmissible to define them as contents of the psyche. Where am I? The mentioned inner images, dominant features of the collective unconscious after Jung, are rather psychic manifestations of the archetypes, which, however, would also have to put forth, create, condition anything law-like in the behavior of the corporeal world. That's the material world. The laws of this world would then be the physical manifestation of the archetypes, and each law of nature, physical nature, should then have an inner correspondence and vice versa, even though this is not always directly visible today, 1948. So I'll give you some key features of this whole picture, the dual aspect monist picture. There's the decompositional dual aspect monist picture. There's an undivided, holistic, psychophysically neutral domain without distinctions such as mind and matter, subject-object, self-world, space-time, and what you want. This distinction, it's basically, it's distinction-free. The mental and physical, both aspects, emerge as dual epistemic aspects due to a partitioning or distinctions of the holistic psychophysically neutral domain. Archetypal patterns are psychophysically neutral order elements between the undivided oneness at the bottom, at the very bottom of the psychophysically neutral, and the mental and the physical aspects. So there's a lot of structure in the psychophysically neutral. It's not just undivided in a kind of overarching sense. There's a lot of structure. Now, when you go from a holistic state into a state which has distinctions, then of course there are always correlations between the distinguished parts. So these psychophysical correlations between the mental and the physical, reflect somehow the lost holism of the archetypal patterns. Now, in science, whenever you see a correlation, you ask yourself the question, where does this correlation actually come from? How can we interpret it or understand it? And the usual reflex in science is we look for a causal background for the correlations. Right? If we can find the causal background, then we have discovered a kind of law, and the law says from this kind of cause, I come to this kind of effect, and that substantiates, in philosophical language, the correlation. If we don't find a causal origin for the correlation, then we say it's probably chance. So that's it. Now, when we talk about correlations between the mental and the physical, then starting with Descartes, it has been increasingly difficult to find a causal background for the correlations, right? And the notion of the causal completeness or causal closure of the physical is something like an expression of this difficulty. So it's now very interesting that all these figures that I mentioned to you before, Pauli, Eddington, Wheeler, Bohm, Hiley, they came up with a completely different idea to explain the correlations. And this idea is the idea that they are substantiated by meaning. In the Bohm picture, it's called active information. Active information is, as we have heard from Paavo, is not just Shannon information. It's really semantic information. It's meaningful information. In the Wheeler picture, it's the meaning circuit. I think Dean might speak about that a little more. We'll see that. And in the Pauli-Jung framework of thinking, meaning arises in what they call synchronistic events, synchronicities, which are considered as meaningful coincidences between mental and physical events. So meaning is in dual aspect monism, is a very important concept. Psychophysical correlations are substantiated neither causally nor by chance, but rather by meaning. And of course, then I will, in the rest of this talk, we'll talk about different versions of meaning to make that concept a little bit more specific. So meaning, in some senses, due to dual aspect monism, posed as a basic relational ingredient of the fabric of reality. Meaning is always relational. It's intrinsic relational because there is something that means and something that is meant. So you have always meaning as a relation between two poles. Now the next slide shows you how or why dual aspect monism has become so interesting for people coming from quantum physics. So I want to talk a little bit about product states in quantum physics, and then try to make the analogy into the mind-matter problem. So here you see a scheme that describes what happens when you measure a bipartite quantum state. So bipartite means that it decomposes into two parts, but the key here is that you start with in physics it's called an entangled state. An entangled state is a non-product state, and a non-product state is a state that cannot be written down in a tensor product representation. Some of you know what it is, some of you don't, but it's not that important that you know the details about it. The important thing is that the non-product state does not offer itself in an experiment as a state that consists of parts. It's a holistic state that does not consist of parts to begin with. In a measurement, when you make a measurement on such a state, then it decomposes into parts. For instance, when you make a spin measurement in the Bell state, that would be the one that I've written down here, then you find the parts with certain properties, spin up, spin down, and you find correlations between the two parts. So this is an intrinsic feature in these non-product states. When you decompose them, then you get parts and correlations between the parts. And we know by now in physics that these correlations are not causal, so they are already something that points to the need to find something that substantiates them outside of the possibility of causation. And of course, in physics, we know how to do all this. We do statistics, and these acausal correlations are today have been measured in so many experiments that people would say this is a phenomenon without any reasonable doubt. Now, the analogy to the mind-body problem. And you can clearly see that there are, the structure of the scheme is very similar, but some of the notions are different. In the mind-body problem, a la dual aspect monism, the Bell state, the entangled state of physics, becomes a state in the psychophysically neutral domain. And again, this is not a product state, because we are talking about a holistic universe in this case. It's not a product state, so it does not present itself as a composition of a mental state and a physical state. Now what happens is, this original psychophysically neutral state can decompose into mental and physical states, as an entangled quantum state can decompose into the states of its parts. And again, we expect an acausal correlation between the mental and the physical. Now, we are working between the physical and the mental. So we cannot simply use statistics or other quantitative methods, because when we want to relate something quantitative in physics to something qualitative in our subjective experience, then it will get very hard to quantify everything. So we need a notion that relates the physical with the mental, and this is the idea of meaning. You have a mental representation, it has some intentional content, and then this relates to an object or to a state of an object in the outside world. So this relationship is the meaning of the mental representation. Now, in dual aspect monism, we do not only have a bipartite picture, we have a tripartite picture. We have the physical, we have the mental, and the psychophysically neutral. So what we can do is, we can represent this tripartite picture in terms of this is called a simplex, it's a triangle if you want, and the vertices of the triangle are the mental, M, the physical, P, and the psychophysically neutral at the bottom, ppn. And these vertices are connected by correlations. I call them sigma 1, sigma 2, and sigma 3. These are pairwise correlations between pairs of vertices. Of course, we also have a triple correlation, which correlates MP and ppn, all three of them. That's what is denoted by rho in this picture. And we know, this is not a physical feature, this is a mathematical feature, that such a simplex has exactly two decomposition classes. That becomes pretty interesting for the rest of the talk. One decomposition class is that your tripartite non-product state can decompose into MP and ppn so that all three of them get independent of one another. They are separable. And the other decomposition class is that you can isolate one of the three, and the other three remain non-product, the other two remain non-product states. So we have, when we single out P, the first option over there, then ppn and M remain non-product. If we single out M, then ppn and P remain non-product. If we single out ppn, then M and P remain non-product. This is maybe not so easy to understand, so I want to give you a kind of topological illustration of this. So the upper state, the GH, that Z state, that would be the one that decomposes into three independent states. And in topology, this is known as the Borromean rings. So the Borromean rings are a knot structure. And when you cut one of the rings, then the other two fall apart as well. Right? So when you cut one, the other two fall apart as well. The lower state, the W state, is different. That decomposes into a non-product pair and a product state. So you can, it's not easy to see that, but in the inner structure of the rings, you see that the knots are different. in you know, it's hard to see that, I guess. But so when you cut one of the rings in the W state situation, the non-Borromean rings, then the other two remain together. They remain non-product. So this is a very interesting structure. And in recent research in mathematics, this field of arithmetic topology has come up where there is even an equivalence between the Borromean and non-Borromean rings with Borromean prime triples. So the smallest one of these prime triples would be 1361 and 937. This looks like a miracle. And for people who don't know this in detail, including myself, it is almost like a miracle. So just to give you some more illustrative pictures here, the Borromean rings get their name from the Palazzo Borromeo, which is a palace in southern Switzerland on an island in Lago Maggiore. The family of the Borromeos used this kind of Borromean construction as their seal. Then you have the Borromean rings in representations of the Christian idea of Trinity, where you have Trinity and unity at the same time. So the unity state would be the non-product state, and it decomposes into three items. Then you have the Borromean rings in the seal of the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, where you have economy, society, and ecology. I don't know. And on the lower right, you have it even in some more mundane context, which is the Ballantine Brewery. And here we have purity, body, and flavor. And only the three of them together make a good beer. Okay, so we still have 10 minutes. These correlations, as I said before, are substantiated by different versions of meaning in dual aspect monism. So we have a triple correlation in the composite system of MP and PPN together. Then we have a surface structure of meaning, which is just the correlation between M and P. These are the aspects, the epistemic aspects, on which we can do research, right? These are epistemic, so we can get them in an experiment. And this surface structure is actually people like Brentano and Thomas Metzinger use this kind of terminology, intentionality, or in Frege's famous and very influential paper of 1890 something, it's also called reference. The surface structure is nothing else than reference or aboutness. And then we have sigma 2 and sigma 3, like here. And these relate the mental and the physical to the psychophysically neutral. And this is what Frege, in this paper that I just mentioned, calls sense. Sense is the mode of presentation of something. So it's in this picture here, it's the mode in which PPN presents itself in M or in P. So Frege, and more recently the German philosopher Marcus Gabriel, has made a lot of use of this distinction between reference and sense, and in particular the deep structure of meaning in terms of Frege's sense. Now, types of deep correlations, we know sigma 2 and sigma 3, that there are relations between the psychophysically neutral and the mental. Like Jung's archetypes, for instance, would be one of the examples. Whenever you have conscious insights from their unconscious origin, this would, in the terminology of Jung, this would be the manifestation of an archetypal pattern, and this would be sense in the sense of Frege. So the relation between the unconscious origin in PPN, in psychophysically neutral, and the mental, that would be a correlation that is substantiated by sense. Spinoza's notion of intuition is exactly the same. Spinoza's intuition is the highest form of knowledge for him. And again, it's a kind of, becoming aware of something that has its origin in the psychophysically neutral. When you look at sigma 3, that's the relation between the psychophysically neutral and the physical domain. And I showed you the quotation by Wolfgang Pauli before when he says, the laws of the physical world are physical manifestation of the archetypes. So the relation between the archetypes and the physical world is exactly the correlation between psychophysical neutrality and the physical world. And this is an interesting response to a famous paper that Wigner published in the 1970s with the title, The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics in the Natural Sciences. So he asks the question, how can it be that the structures of mathematics, which a priori have nothing to do with physics, match the physical world so well? In dual aspect monism, this is because of sigma 3. The relations, the meaningful relations between the psychophysically neutral and the physical world. Now, the last point in this presentation is a little discussion of surface correlations. I think these are particularly interesting if you really want to do research on dual aspect monism, dual aspect thinking, because the surface correlations connect the mental and the physical. And and that's what we can see in our everyday experience. So here we have a distinction between what we call structural and persistent psychophysical correlations. I put you under stress, your heart rate goes up. That's robust, that's persistent. And we have induced and occasional psychophysical correlations. So the structural correlations are reproducible, like in psychophysiology. The induced correlations are typically not. They can happen, 2 times yes, 1 time no, or if you go to what we call once-in-a-lifetime experiences, which change your whole life and transform what you're doing. This is just by definition only happening once in your lifetime, so this is definitely not reproducible. So the structural correlations, the robust ones, provide a baseline because they are robust, they're just there. And the induced correlations typically deviate from that baseline, more or less. Deviations can be positive or negative. The positive ones we call excess correlations, the negative ones deficit correlations. So experiences of coincidence and experiences of dissociation. And both are experienced as meaningful because they deviate from the baseline. The baseline is just the baseline that's, so to speak, the basis of our psychophysiology. And only if something deviates from that baseline, it is experienced as meaningful. So from this idea here, we can derive a kind of taxonomy of experiences that deviate from the baseline. And I don't want to go into too much detail here, because that was the talk that we had in the workshop on Monday, where we were talking about all kinds of empirical approaches to these surface correlations. I just want to say that the coincidence phenomena connect ordinarily disconnected elements of self-model and world model, while the dissociation phenomena disconnect ordinarily connected elements of self-model and world model, like out-of-body experiences, sleep paralysis, something like that. And the coincidence phenomena, that's essentially what Jung, for which Jung coined the notion of synchronistic events, meaningful coincidences. So there is a lot of empirical research that, as I said, has been presented and summarized last Monday. Also, I want to mention that the talk by Tanja Luhrmann on, Wednesday, also can be, classified in this taxonomy. Ann Taves is another researcher at the University of Santa Barbara who is working on this. And I don't go into this in too much detail. Here's a kind of summary of much of the empirical research that has been done. And this shows contour plots of frequencies with which these different phenomena have been observed. And so this plot has many interesting aspects which I cannot cover in the remaining time. The summary of this is that dual aspect monism considers the mental and the physical as dual aspects of an underlying psychophysically neutral whole, the psychophysically neutral PPN. Meaning plays an essential role in connecting these three domains, mental, the physical, and the PPN. It connects them as sense, insofar as the deep structure is concerned, which relates PPN with M and P, and it plays its role as reference as far as the surface structure is concerned, relating M and P. We have two types of surface correlations, just saw them, which provide a systematic taxonomy of psychophysical correlations. And this is already supported by quite a number of empirical studies of exceptional experiences in clinical psychology, psychophysiology, and in psychophysics. Now, the last slide, or the last two slides, are some kind of summary of the possible benefits and prospects of dual aspect monism. It gives us a tripartite structure rather than a bipartite or single-partite structure of the relation between the mental and the physical. So it expands the space for understanding MP correlations. The different decomposition classes that I showed you in one of the slides can reproduce physicalist, idealist, and dualist intuitions as special cases of dual aspect monism. Depending on which of the three vertices you trace out, you get different situations. Mind-matter correlations are explained by their common origin. Empirical predictions can be derived from a metaphysical framework. This is something which is really happening rarely in the history of ideas, that you have a metaphysical picture and really can push it or derive from it something that can be empirically supported or rejected. Then the deep structure, meaning has a deep structure and a surface structure that really goes along with Frege's paper, with Frege's ideas. It provides an interpretation of acausal correlations. No modification of the physical and of physics in general is required. Of course, modulo progress within physics itself. Then dual aspect monism also predicts non-commutative processes in psychology. We heard the talk by Jerome yesterday, which showed some very nice examples for this. And finally, we propose a continuous spectrum of graded reproducibilities. In science, usually reproducibility is required as a kind of basic criterion, often considered as a yes-no thing, either something has been reproduced or not. Based on the idea of deviations from the baseline of psychophysical correlations, dual aspect monism proposes that reproducibility needs to be considered in a more flexible way. Some events may never be reproduced. Once in a lifetime experiences will never be reproduced, and the Big Bang will also never be reproduced. Thank you for your attention. So I think I'm my own chairman. So are there questions? Yes, let's begin over there.
I'd like to get a little clarification on what you mean by meaning.
Yeah.
When I think of the word meaning, what something means to me is all the implications that follow from it, inferences that you can draw, counterfactuals that are ruled out, a variety of things that are cognitive. You seem to be talking about something that's out there in the real world.
Yes.
Can you explain that?
Yes. The meaning that's outside in the world, of course, is experienced in our subjective experience, right? But the structural picture that I try to paint is bigger than our subjective experience. Meaning, in the picture that I try to show is an intrinsically relational notion between something that means and something that's meant, a mental representation and what it represents. So there are all these different kind of formulations that you can use. So that's the, I think, that's the key to understand the different kinds of meaning that I was talking about, sense and reference. They're always intrinsically relational. And we are not used to experience relational things. We are typically reifying them. So we push the meaning actually into the content of a mental representation and think then the business is done. Whitehead would call that a fallacy of misplaced concreteness.
Okay, thank you.
So, over there. Please.
Thank you. I want to thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah, maybe you speak up a little bit.
I want to thank you for great presentation, very informative. And I want to thank Stuart for giving me an opportunity to present my theory at the conference, which does explain the meaning of meaning. The theory name is How Consciousness Emerges from Matter and Energy. It recommended for testing by National Science Foundation directors. This theory is unconventional, closing the gap and answers over 20 unsolved problems.
So maybe you can send me your paper, and then I read it and respond to you. Because
yes.
right at this point, we should really, you see that there are many more people who have questions.
Yeah, I just want to tell that you can see it as a poster
Good.
tonight.
Perfect.
So, and one more, consciousness can be captured in a simple equation, x apostrophe equal y apostrophe. Thank you.
X equal y, that's good. Please.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Just wanted to clarify, I heard you say that meaning was subjective.
Meaning is experienced subjectively, but structurally speaking, it's relational. That's what I was saying.
Relational, yeah. And can we say that there's an objective nature to that relational meaning? Like you agree relationally, and someone from the outside could also verify it, those correlations?
The person who experiences the meaning, that's the one who is, it's the only one who is entitled to say this is the meaning. But it's a question of whether you detect it or whether you detect it not. Mm-hmm. Right? And then you can say it's there or not.
So the judgment of this is good or bad would be subjective, yes?
The judgment, the judgment is done in your subjective experience, yes.
And the correlations themselves might be considered objective or relational.
Yeah, like the example that I gave you, when you're under stress, then your blood pressure goes up. Then the blood pressure can be measured quantitatively.
Right.
But the stress is a qualitative feature of your subjective experience. So these two are related, whether you want to call that objective or subjective. I would say it's a link between the two. That's the whole point of thinking relationally, right? You don't want to push the thing that you're talking about into the mental, and you don't want to push it into the physical. It's really relational. I'm sorry to repeat that.
Yeah, thank you. That's very good.
That's good. Thank you. So I think we should have two more questions, and then go to the next speaker. Please.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you so much for the great talk. Kind of in the same realm as like what is this meaning you're talking about? Is there a basis for why you believe the meaning is a reality that's baked within the fabric of reality, as opposed to like just something we experience, kind of this bi-directional problem of like, how do you resolve this as a real thing, as opposed to we receive it due to these coincidences or dissociations?
So one answer is that we see psychophysical relations between the mental and the physical all the time, right? And the question is, how can we interpret these correlations? I think there's much evidence that we cannot interpret them, substantially at least, by causation. And when they're still there and not random, then you have to look for something else, some other currency, which is not causal. And the proposal that I have been making is that we use meaning as a substantiation of these correlations. We see this meaning between the mental and the physical. We see it very often. And then Frege, the philosopher who I mentioned, would suggest that there's another type of meaning which relates the mental and the physical to the psychophysically neutral ground. That's a proposal. I'm not saying this is the truth. The truth cannot be written down anyway. Okay? So last question over there, and then we go to Dean.
Harald, thank you for the very good talk. I have a question about the decomposition of the entangled you get the entangled physical and mental state, which is a pure state that decomposes into a mental state separate from a physical state.
Yeah.
But that decomposition should then produce density states, mixed states, right? So we can never observe a pure state and a pure physical?
That's right, yes. So the mixed state would be on the one side would be a mental state, on the other side it would be a physical state.
So you get a mixed finished, and then you get a mixed physical state when you're finished.
Exactly.
Two mixed states.
Two mixed states. Oh yeah, these are of course, you know, we can go into much more detail when we talk about this story. I think, you know, for an interdisciplinary audience like this, we can't do this really.
Yeah,
but we can work that out in detail, you know, you and me.
Yeah, okay, I will.
Thank you, Jerome. So the next speaker will be Dean Rickles. You know him already as the co-author on our book on dual aspect monism, and Dean is from the University of Sydney. We'll talk about decompositional dual aspect monism and the no juicing theorem, whatever that is. He will explain.
Okay, thank you, Harald. Okay, so this talk is going to sort of employ this decompositional approach to dual aspect monism that Harald's just described, which I take to be sort of compressible into the basic idea that we start with a unitary, undivided, unconditioned absolute totality, and consider how it gets split into aspects, the properties of the aspects of which are generated by the structure that gets split. What I'm going to show is that there is a natural limitative result that emerges from this way of thinking about things that I call the no juicing theorem. So some of you might recognize the word juicing. It's actually Douglas Hofstadter's expression, an acronym he coined that means jumping out of the system. So the way he used it was as a way of distinguishing human cognition from machine cognition. So, you know, the idea was that whereas maybe you can have a game of chess, a computer that can play a game of chess, you know, for a simulation, and it can be in the game of chess, humans are able to jump outside of the system and survey what's going on in the game of chess as well. And that was supposed to be somehow a way of distinguishing them. What this talk is about is a natural limit on how often we can juice, how often we can jump out of the system. And what we can't do is jump out of our eye-centric representations to survey those representations with the way things really are. So there's a limitation on what we can know about that totality, given this idea that we're decomposing it to gain knowledge, and gain aspects. So let me set things up with a slightly unlikely source for a talk like this, which is from Manly P. Hall's Pathways of Philosophy. So he makes 3 remarks here. So first, science is nothing more than the image of truth. Absolute truth is truth of being, and relative truth is truth of knowing. These differ only as a direct ray of light differs from a refracted ray, and so the difference is in degree rather than in substance. So I agree with this one, that there are these two, what I would think of as complementary modes of something like existence, which is being and knowing. I would disagree with these other elements, though, because what they suggest is something like Karl Popper's notion of verisimilitude, that there's a way of getting closer to the truth. And if you just keep stacking up enough of those relative truths, you're going to eventually get to the absolute truth. So I disagree with that. And I disagree with this notion that you can ever have an image of truth. Right? The notion of an image by itself suggests being a representation which is always distinct and detached from the thing that it's representing. There's no sort of perfect image we could ever get of the truth. So I think we're a little bit more in the position of this remark from another unlikely source, which is Ambrose Bierce's Devil's Dictionary. So he gives a nice definition of the mind like this, that it's a mysterious form of matter secreted by the brain, whose chief activity consists in the endeavor to ascertain its own nature, the futility of the attempt being due to the fact that it has nothing but itself to know itself with. So this, this sort of puts us in mind of another Hofstadter type idea, which is the strange loop, right? The idea of the self and the I is basically a single step strange loop, right? It brings itself into being, shields itself off from everything that is not I, and you get a nice division in this way. Looking at things this way, we also see something like the futility of the attempt to know thyself, right? What would know thyself involve? Well, it would mean turning the knower into the known, but then that leaves this additional knower that's now knowing the known, which would also need to be turned into a known, and you end up with infinite regresses. You can imagine doing a universe, a cosmic version of this, where the universe might be on its own know thyself project, right? If we've got this totality and it wants to know itself, well, the only thing it can do is split into knower and known, but as soon as it does that, it can never get outside of itself to check whether the representation it's got as a knower matches the way things really are. So we're something like in this position, right? We're surrounded by a wall built of our own conceptions of the world, and we're unable to look over the wall at the real world. So this still, though, supposes that there is something like a real world over the wall. And this obviously puts us in mind of something like Kant, who believes that we can only experience the world through certain categories, right? The standard, one of the most common ones is the idea of space, right? We can speak of space and extended beings in space and so on only from the human standpoint. Without the human standpoint, you don't get any space. It simply doesn't make sense. So there are obviously lots of problems with Kant's ideas, not least the fact that the space he was talking about here was based on Newtonian physics, which was based on Euclidean geometry. His notion of causality was associated with Newtonian physics. Both were overturned by relativity and quantum theory. We have other problems. I mean, so Harald has actually looked at the possibility, following some work of Jean Gebser, of acategorical experience, these deeper kinds of experience. We heard from Bill the other day on the chauvinism objection, that this seems to be based on the human standpoint, but surely there's many different kinds of standpoint we can have that would give different kinds of experiences and worlds. And there's also this specter of the thing in itself, this real world behind the wall, which is also problematic. So a more radical version of this, known as radical constructivism, gets around some of these problems. So this is a quote from von Glaserfeld, one of the main figures associated with this view. And he says, what we call knowledge does not and could not represent a world that is supposed to be beyond our experiential interface with it. Radical constructivism doesn't deny an ulterior reality, but it does deny that human rational knowledge can attain a God-made world or produce anything that could rightly be called a representation of it. So there's no notion of copying or getting closer to some absolute truth in this kind of approach. And so these kind of approaches take us away from what is characteristic of most modern science. It's changing a bit these days, but it's still pretty persistent, which is what I'll call the objectivity commandment, which is that you should not allow properties of observers into the descriptions of observations. You assume that you can detach the source of those observations and just consider the world as it is, and your experience is really just the world as it is. So there's a nice quote that shows very quickly the error of this way of thinking, which is a book by slightly less well-known philosopher A.D. Ritchie, who's talking about Eddington's theories. And he says, to see the error of this kind of objectivity commandment, it's enough to remember that the observer at the subjective pole is also an agent or operator and can make his presence felt if he wants to. So this puts us in mind of, this kind of observer-observed connection that we find in Niels Bohr's ideas. So he says that there's the impossibility of a sharp separation between the behavior of the atomic object and the interaction with the measuring instruments, which serve to define the conditions under which the phenomena appear. And of course, we're in charge of defining those conditions under which the phenomena appear. So this meme is quite funny, but it's not very good for representing Bohr's the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, because all of these other girlfriend states here, they would have no meaning whatsoever. They just would not be there. The only thing that would exist is just the observer and the observed quantum state here. But it fits a little bit better John Wheeler's development of Bohr's interpretation of quantum mechanics, where he now considers the observer not as a passive thing, but an observer participator. And the function of this thing is precisely to convert states of potentiality or conceivability into actuality. So I call this this idea that without the observer participator, there's no actual world, Jontology. And it relates to something that's been mentioned a few times in this conference, the idea of it from bit. Now, this is frequently misinterpreted, mainly because it's people tend to interpret it literally as if it's a complete expression. But it from bit was never supposed to be anything other than a catchy title. It's not a complete description of Wheeler's theory, which is that it's it from bit mediated by this observer participator that's converting what is essentially the infinite potentiality in the bits into some finite actual bit, right? So just to give a simple example, I mean, the bits can mean anything that you want them to mean. Just like this bottle of water can mean infinitely many different things. I can make it mean any one of infinitely many real numbers, for example. Until I've done that, it isn't pinned down what this thing means. So we find, I mean, it would be, to say that it from bit is the complete story would be a little bit like saying that speech is basically just vibrations of vocal cords and columns of air. Right? That's obviously not the function of speech. The whole point of speech is to convey information. It's about information. So if you interpret it as just it from bit, you remove the sort of the substance from this way of thinking. So as Wheeler puts it, meaning is the thing that powers creation, right? Semantic meaning. So another way of thinking about it from bit is that we get ontogenesis from semiogenesis, from the creation of meaning. So as he puts it, how do we make up reality? Well, how do we build this thing? No more attractive clue offers itself for attacking this great issue than the way information is processed to make meaning. What are the implications of this? Well, that, as he puts it, nature at the quantum level isn't a machine that goes its inexorable way. It's wrong to think of the universe as sitting out there. Instead, what we get depends on what question we put, what experiment we arrange, right? This is what Harald was mentioning, we have a choice of what questions we put to the world, what registering device we choose, so that we are inescapably involved in bringing about that which appears to be happening. Now, in terms of quantum theory, one of the problems, of course, is that it's incomplete, doesn't have sufficient structure to determine all of the answers to all of the questions that you can put to it. So Wheeler's idea was, as he says on this card when he was first starting to think about these things, that we should add participant to the undecidable propositions to then arrive at a more complete physics. So this is a way of completing physics. And this is an example of decompositional dual aspect monism. You start with this totality, which is this state of pure potentiality, only by adding the participator, which enacts a kind of splitting between this totality into an observed world and the rest of it. This fits very well, this dual aspect picture. And it seems to give us something closer to a, not quite a theory of everything, which usually means this, a theory that obeys the objectivity commandment, and we're talking about the things. It gives us a more totalitarian theory, which sort of is supposed to expand a little bit more into the inside and the outside, because it's including both the subject and the object. So the question is, how far can we get with this kind of theory where we're trying to include both sides, both poles here? So we can quickly rehearse the usual options again. So the usual options on what is fundamental. So we can say that matter is the fundamental thing, and we're led towards things like materialism. Problem with materialism is that, well, you have to describe how we get the subjective perspective and this amazing technicolor display that we all have. Or you can say that mind is fundamental, and you're led towards idealist positions, and you face the inverse problem of trying to explain how you get apparently solid law-like behaviors and intersubjectivity and these kinds of things. You can say that both mind and matter are fundamental, but they're completely different things, and you're led to dualisms, in which case you have to explain how, given that they're so different, can they interact and produce these correlations. Or you can say, as we do in the book that Harald mentioned, and other dual aspect monists do, that neither mind nor matter are fundamental, but something else is fundamental, and these are somehow emerging or being generated in some way by this deeper structure. So the idea that we should decompose a totality in order to generate the mind and matter rather than composing them is a pretty old idea. So some other examples can be found in, for example, Goethe's Polarity, his piece on polarity. As he puts it, what appears in the world must divide if it's to appear at all. Why? Because, well, to appear, you need to appear to something. We can find it in Jakob Böhm, who says the one, this totality, has nothing within itself which it could possibly desire because it's undifferentiated, right? It's non-dual. Neither can such a unity feel its own self. This is only possible in a state of duality, so it needs to split into an I and an it, or a self and world. Obviously, the problem with this approach, as Harald mentioned, is to consider what this deeper structure is, what kind of thing it is. What we can say is, and what I'm to relate it back to the Manly P. Hall idea, there seem to be two complementary modes. There's a stage at which we can literally say nothing whatsoever, right, about the nature of the structure, because to say something would mean putting it into frames, categorizing it, and conditioning what is supposed to be unconditioned. So, there's all kinds of ancient philosophers and ancient esoteric thinkers who try and make sense of this, but ultimately you can't make sense of it. You have to say something like it's the Ein Sof, and you just sort of worship it, but don't say much about it. Everything other than that is going to be relative, and you can sort of probe down more deeply into this realm. As Harald mentioned, you can consider that there's archetypes down there. They're psychophysically neutral, but they are somehow responsible for generating the way that we experience the world, right? The mode of representation. An example that I like to use is the notion of a composition, a piece of music, right? What's special about a piece of music is that it can be multiply instantiated. Although to hear it and experience it, we need some particular implementation on particular instruments. It can be played over and over again, so it's completely outside of space-time in one sense, even though it needs to be brought into space-time and into our experience in another sense. I think one of the best ways of thinking about how this projection process actually works from this deeper structure into mind and matter is due to David Bohm, who was, as Harald mentioned, a very good candidate for a decompositional dual aspect monist. Right? The way he puts it is that there's this thing which is neither mind nor body, but rather a higher dimensional actuality, which is their common ground, and which is of a nature beyond both, which it has to be in order to generate them. As he puts it, we don't say that mind and body causally affect one another, but rather that the movements of both are the outcome of related objections from this common higher dimensional ground. And he gives a great example to make sense of this, which is he imagines that we've set up a situation where we've got an aquarium, there's a single fish in the aquarium, we set a pair of cameras on different sides of the aquarium, we've put a video feed from those cameras to a pair of screens. We only have access to the screens. Okay, so what do we see on those screens? Well, we'll see on one camera a fish coming towards us. On the other camera, we'll see like the bottom of the fish, and it's going from right to left. And as the fish moves around, you'll see that these screens appear to be correlated. Even though it appears to be two fish, they appear to be correlated. But we know in this case, by construction of the example, that they're not causally correlated. It's one single thing being viewed from different aspects. So this is the way that you're supposed to think about the way that this deeper structure is getting projected upwards into something that appears to be distinct but isn't distinct. Now, the most recent, like the new kid on the block when it comes to decompositional dual aspect monism, I think is Stephen Wolfram's new physics project. So this is not the same as his New Kind of Science, which I saw the book New Kind of Science on one of the desks in the other building. This is a very different theory that he's just been working on for the last few years. I'm not going to say too much about it because it's a huge theory, actually. If you want to learn about it, you can either read his book, which is the size of a small building, or you can read the paper that I wrote with a couple of his research staff, actually. It goes into some of the philosophical implications. So the basic idea of this theory is, and again, it's supposed to have pretensions to being a totalitarian theory, and that it includes the observer and the observed. The idea is that it's supposed to be a space of all possible computations. And unlike his earlier work, where you're dealing with individual computation over time, you imagine situations where you get branching structure. So imagine you've got some initial string, maybe BA, and you're trying to do some computation that sorts the string into alphabetical order. There will be a rule that tells you whenever you see BA, switch them into AB. But depending on what kind of strings you have, there might be many different ways of doing this on one single string. This approach is multi-computational, that you do it all at once and you get a huge branching structure. And you do this for all initial data and all possible rules, and you imagine evolving this system to its infinite limit, and it has a reasonable representation as a mathematical structure called an infinity groupoid, but on its own, this structure has no meaning, right? It's just a set of abstract evolutions of rules on initial data. So he recognizes that if you want to get physics and other things out of this system, you have to add the local observers, and he understands these observers in terms of this thing called computational boundedness. So computational boundedness just means anything that's smaller than the whole space, so it can't sample the entirety of the space. You add other elements to the observer, like a certain kind of persistence, but the crucial aspect and what the observer is performing is this notion of equivalencing. Right, so equivalencing is something like the way we form concepts, right? We have a concept of bottle that exceeds all of the kinds of lots of differences that aren't important for the concept of bottle. So it could be glass, it could be plastic, it could be tin or something like that. They're all bottles, and we equivalence down a very large, possibly infinite space of these into something finite, into a concept. And we do the same in physics, right? In statistical mechanics, there are a lot of configurations that don't affect the temperature, so you kind of average or coarse grain over a whole different bunch of these microstates, these microscopic configurations, to generate something macroscopic. So this is the role of the observer. And the way he defines it puts one in mind exactly of this earlier Wheeler quote that I had, right? So he says, whenever a system does enough equivalencing, that's tantamount to it acting like an observer, because it can then act as a front end that takes the incoherent complexity of the world and collimates it to the point where a mind will derive a definite impression from it. So this is basically just Wheeler's idea that the observer, participator, is something that converts conceivability into actuality. And you can find a whole bunch of correspondences to sort of demonstrate that this new approach of Wolfram's is a dual aspect, a decompositional dual aspect approach. So in standard dual aspect monism, decompositional dual aspect monism, we have the idea that there's the ontic base, the most fundamental thing, which is a psychophysically neutral structure that underlies possible experience and appears through splitting. Wolfram would say something like, there's an abstract single structure, this he calls it the Rouliad, that underlies all possible experience that appears now through sampling local parts of this thing. There's a duality split in the other approaches, which say something like, without mind-matter polarity, you don't get a world. Wolfram would say something like, without observer transduction of this raw information, you don't get a world, and physics and these kinds of things. A sort of natural epistemology of the decompositional approach would be something like Wheeler's claim here, that it's not consciousness, but the distinction between the probe and probed that is central to the elemental quantum act of observation that gives us our phenomena that mark what he calls the iron post of observation that become our knowledge. Wolfram would say this, that the task is to examine the structure and dynamics of interacting computational paths and their passing by observers. So I think it's a sort of clear case that it's an example of decompositional dual aspect monism and a new one. But I mean, something I'm thinking about at the moment is the extent to which this also fits into the pattern of second-order cybernetics, or vice versa, where the second-order cybernetics fits into this decompositional dual aspect approach. So you probably know what cybernetics is, right? It's about you're observing complex systems, you're looking at feedback loops in systems, maybe between effectors and receptors, and so on. Second-order cybernetics considers the systems that are making observations on those systems as well. So it becomes the cybernetics of cybernetics. You include both the subject and the object in your modeling of the world. And then if you go and look at some of the things that second-order cyberneticists have said, you find that they're remarkably similar to what people like Wheeler are saying and what we discuss in our book on decompositional dual aspect monism. So Heinz von Förster here, who is one of the chief architects of this second-order cybernetics approach, writes that if the properties of the observer, namely to observe and describe, are eliminated, there's nothing left. Okay, so this is basically the idea that no observer, no world. There's no observation, there's no description. However, there was a justification for adhering to this principle, and this justification was fear. Fear that paradoxes would arise when the observers were allowed to enter the universe of their own observations. And you know the threat of paradoxes, to steal their way into a theory is like having the cloven-hoofed foot of the devil stuck in the door of orthodoxy. So we end up in this situation that Schrödinger mentions. He also discusses this idea, which is that we don't end up belonging to the material world that science is constructing for us. And he gives an example of Dürer's, the artist Albrecht Dürer's painting All Saints. So we end up looking at the main picture there, and we forget that Dürer painted himself as a little side figure in this painting, just to point out that he was the source of this thing. But we don't even get that in most modern science. We are completely eliminated from the description. So Wolfram himself seems to be aware of this, but he's sort of inconsistent in what he does with this. So he says that it's a typical first instinct in thinking about doing science that you imagine yourself doing an experiment on a system, but you, as the observer, are outside of the system. Of course, if you're thinking about modeling the whole universe and everything in it, as he is, this isn't ultimately a reasonable way to think about things, because the observer is inevitably part of the universe, and so it has to be modeled just like everything else, right? So there's sort of these two complementary ways of thinking about things, right? You can either be this observer who stands outside, or you can be a part of the thing that you're modeling. The non-juiced, sort of the non-jumping out of the system approach would be this sort of temporal thing. It has creation and destruction. It's unfinished. It's finite. You might associate with constructivist mathematical ideas. And then there's the juiced perspective, which is that we're able somehow to look upon this, the Reuliad in Wolfram's case, this complete structure, as this atemporal, eternal, completed, infinite system. But given what he just said on the previous slide, it's also true that that Reuliad is a construction that was made, right? The concept, the representation of the Reuliad was made within this non-juiced system. So he wants to say, as he does, in the end it's all just Reuliad. However, that it means that Stephen Wolfram himself, the architect of this Reuliad theory, has to exist in that Reuliad. But given his previous statement, if that's true, then the Reuliad has to be in his representations as well. But then he's in the Reuliad, and we end up with this cloven-hoofed devil paradox situation coming in, where we end up with these regresses. So no less a figure than Max Planck was seemingly aware of this. He has a great book that everybody should read called Where is Science Going? And in this he says that science can't solve the ultimate mystery of nature, and that's because in the last analysis, we ourselves are part of the mystery that we're trying to solve. Max Planck himself still suggested that we should sort of pretend as if we can continue going on and adding knowledge for mental health reasons, he even mentions, for our mental well-being. So as if in response to this, Peter Kingsley in his book on reality writes, to keep pushing back the boundaries of knowledge is quite the opposite of getting to the edges of knowledge. In fact, it's simply a way of extending the hangman's rope. What we need is to be able to reach so far that we can touch the noose that binds us. And in the experience of completeness, there's nothing to become, there's nothing else to look forward to, and the endless searching is over. So, to recap, so we have this decompositional approach that involves this splitting into mind, or the I, and matter, or not I. This gives us the no-juicing theorem, which means we're unable from this way of forming things to jump out of the system, because we're always going to be part of the system. So we can consider that there's two paths that come from this situation, and neither of them yields absolute knowledge. We can either do something like sort of these perpetual jumping out of the systems, knowing that there's always going to be another jump to come. I call this eternal inflation of knowledge systems. And in fact, Freeman Dyson has a paper on Gödel's theorem applied to physics where he mentions something like this, and he sees it as a good thing because it means that we're always finding new things out, even though they're never, ever going to get us near to absolute knowledge. This has the problem of incompleteness. It's never going to be a complete account that we have. Right? Max Planck puts it this way in the same book, that we must admit that in no case can we rest assured that what is absolute in science today will remain absolute for all time. Not only that, we must admit as certain the truth that the absolute can never be finally grasped by the researcher. The absolute represents an ideal goal which is always ahead of us and which we can never reach, and we're always struggling from the relative to absolute. On the other hand, we have this sort of second-order cybernetic approach, which I think is a natural one for the dual aspect monist, which involves this sort of strange looping where we accept the relative nature of all of the knowledge that we're getting. In this case, we end up with undecidables. There are things that we know we can never decide the absolute truth of, which might sound pretty bad, but there's a possible sort of lifesaver in this, which Heinz von Forster makes quite clear, which is that we are, given this situation, under no compulsion, not even that of logic, when we decide on in-principle undecidable questions. There's no external necessity, i.e. in the framework that we're using, that forces us to answer such questions one way or the other, right? If the framework itself can't answer these questions, then they're free to be answered however we like. So the complement to necessity is not chance, it's choice, and then we can choose who we wish to become when we have decided on an in-principle undecidable question. So we can decide on things like, what is it to be human, for example, which your framework will not be able to decide, and you can decide how to make that go as well as you like. And this is sort of quite a William Jamesian approach. He has a very similar attitude to these, to questions like, what happens after death? Is there life after death? Right? These are sort of in-principle undecidable questions, unless you kill yourself and then you can see whether it's true or false, and it's associated with pragmatism. So it might not necessarily be quite so pessimistic as it might look at first sight. Okay, and I will leave it there with also a shameless plug of a couple of new books that go into some of these issues that I've talked about here. Thank you.
Thank you thank you so much, Dean, for your talk. We have time for maybe 3 or 4 questions. Please.
Well, thank you, Dean. That was really great. It's awesome to see an anti-realist view represented on the main stage. And so I feel like this view is really helpful in explaining some of these long-standing challenges that we've had. I feel like we can substantiate this model through Joachim Kepler's zero-point field theory, in which we're all pulling the aspects of our experience from a shared zero-point field, combined with Hunt and Schooler's general resonance theory, where the basis of our collective experience, such as having your talk here for all of us today, is shared resonance. So, and I feel like this helps to explain some things that have been problems for us for a while, such as the double slit experiment. So why is it that only when we look at where that particle comes through, does it then the wave function collapse? All of this stuff. And Wigner's friend, so it collapses for Wigner, it collapses for his friend in that active observation for that individual entity. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on these sorts of things. But it seems like this is all very complementary with like a dual aspect monism type approach.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I must say I don't know this zero-point approach. I mean, one way of viewing this whole dual aspect monist approach is that there is something like a ultimate zero, this unconditioned zero that can be split. And you can imagine solutions like -1 and +1 as you get in a Bell entanglement experiment. Right? The idea is that there's a preservation, a conservation of that initial zero that you can almost cheat. You can almost cheat the zero by getting this +1 and -1 and getting some aspects out of it. I don't know whether that's the nature of this case that you're talking about with the zero-point field.
Okay. Yeah, I feel like they probably play together. So.
Yeah, I mean, obviously one of the motivating factors behind John Wheeler's approach was precisely the double slit experiment and trying to make sense of that, and the idea that there literally is no way the world is until you have decided on which particular one of those measurements, whether it's a momentum measurement or a position measurement, you're going to perform. So the world itself doesn't know what it is until you've told it, asked it a particular question, which will then sort of reduce the possible answers it can give. Right? The reason why we think there's still something else out there is because we're not able to predict definitely which answer we're going to get. It's always going to be from a class of possible answers, depending on whether we make a position measurement or a momentum measurement. So the chance and the surprise gives us reason for thinking that we're not idealists. It's not just our thoughts creating this thing. Otherwise, we'd have it exactly as we wanted it. So, yeah.
Perfect, thank you.
Okay, the next question goes over there.
Yeah, thank you, Dean, very much, and Harald as well. This is fantastic. And when I hear both of you talking about this, and I get into dual aspect monism and neutral monism, I'm struck with parallels with Heideggerian phenomenology, the analytic of Dasein, as we as Dasein are always in the world, and we are a unitary experience of the world, with the world, in the world. And it just strikes me that there's just so much synchronicity with his thoughts and what is being discussed here and what I'm working on as well. What are your thoughts on that? And if you haven't looked at Heidegger, maybe consider looking at him.
Well, certainly his work on the notion of nothingness, das Nichts, fits very well here. So I used to think it was absolute crazy, bonkers continental stuff, his talk on nothingness, but what it gets at is the fact that you will never be able to, we want to describe what the fundamental nature, the absolute nature of reality is, and we get into tangles like Heidegger did when we try, because it is a literal impossibility to try and explain the fundamental nature of reality. Hence what I'm saying here is that we're sort of forced always into relative facts, even though we have reasons to thinking that there's a ground. And he got a lot of his ideas. In fact, he has some nice lectures on Schelling and Schelling's notion of nothingness. So I tend to share Schelling's particular definition of nothingness, which is almost a kind of statement of a superposition. So his idea of what this fundamental ground is, the best we can do with it, is that it's something which is not in a product state, as Harald mentioned, but it's something like A, not A, neither A nor not A, both A and not A, right? So there's like this, so the Indian logicians would call this a tetralemma or Chattoskotti, and you usually consider these to be mutually exclusive, but what Schelling's saying is, no, there's some bizarre mixture of these things that it has to have in order to be able to generate even dualities like being and nothingness, being and non-being. It needs to be beneath even that to generate all dualities.
Right.
Thank you, Dean.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
there's
Thank you.
two more questions over there, and then I think we should proceed to the next speaker.
I really like your talk. It's nice and refreshing to hear names like Emily B. Hall and Jacob Berman. I have an issue understanding absolute knowledge or knowing the absolute, because that itself, it's a paradox, because it implies that there are things to know about, because the one is everything and at the same time nothing is a singularity. So I believe that we can know more than our human experience. For example, now we have Maxwell's equations. We know the unseen radio waves, things like this, that in the past were unseen. So are we limited only to our human view of the world? Or are we limited forever? Are we doomed?
No, so you're doomed with respect to pure absolute knowledge for reasons I explained, but you can probe much deeper. Harald mentioned this. This is the whole point of the deep structure of meaning. But it's always relative facts that are being projected up from this deeper structure that have to eventually enter our experience. Even if it's more acategorical experience, we still need to have an experiencer and the experienced. So this is what I mean by saying that being and knowing are complementary aspects. You might be able to get into a state of being, but you will never know any elements of that being, because to do so you would have to immediately split it.
Yes.
Right? So you're only ever going to get relative facts. You can certainly generate facts that seem to be deeper than the mind-matter, the psychophysically non-neutral realm, by doing things like mathematics, interpreting dreams, dealing with music and things like this. But it still has to be filtered, projected up into our experience.
So it cannot be known.
Wait a second. We have one final question, and then Bill will be the next speaker.
Okay, thank you very much, Dean. Very good summary, and thank you also, Harald. In fact, Harald, you drew reference to a little bit of the history of dual aspect monism. And of course, it has a longer pedigree, going back to, say, the Sankhya philosophers of India, in which they posit exactly that, a psychophysical wholeness, which can give the evolutes or decomposition of mind and matter. But my question is that just considering the issues of mind seemed, and the issues and properties of the observer, and then requiring participant, was exactly the sort of questions that were being asked by the Vedanta scholars of Sankhya. And the danger is, are you breaking that commandment by conflating the properties of the observer into these decompositioned mind or mental qualities? Because the Vedanta philosophers said, you need to extend this box. You can have a dual aspect monism which produces mind and matter, but you need to extend that to include an observer and participant entangled in that system that is observing and participating with it through volition, and doing the sort of co-creation, if you like, or what was that other word you used, in which the world is responding to the properties of an observer.
Yeah, I mean, that's a difficult question. Obviously, this is the main problem, is trying to make sense of what this observer-participator is that seems to have free will. So I have a paper, so in the book I mentioned at the end, this Varieties of Nothingness book, I have a paper that answers this, and it uses this answer I just gave about the shelling. It seems that both the freedom of quantum mechanics for being able to give us chance answers, right, probabilistic answers, is the same as the thing that gives us the freedom to ask the questions as well. So our freedom both comes, the freedom of the world and our freedom both come out of this much deeper, completely non-dual realm. And obviously it's extremely difficult to try and get your head around that and say anything sensible about it because of the concepts that you're dealing with. You end up saying crazy things like Heidegger was led to, like the nothing-noths and stuff like that, in order to make sense of it. But yeah, it's a good question, and it's a problem that I'm
I'll have a good look at the paper. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Thank you once more, Dean.
Are you introducing Bill? Are you introducing Bill?
Yeah. Okay. And the final speaker in this morning session will be Professor William Seager from the University of Toronto. I want to add that Bill is one of the most recent fellows of the Canadian, of the, what is it, the Royal Academy of Canada?
Society.
Royal Society of Canada. So please welcome with me Bill Seager.
Okay, great, thank you. First of all, I apologize. I have more slides than I can get through, so I'll be moving fast through some of them. Much of it will not be new to people here. So first, the problem of consciousness. Here you see many historical expressions of what David Chalmers came to call the hard problem. William James, whom I'm going to talk about, was steeped in these kinds of worries, except, of course, for the one on the bottom left. But bottom right, that's a modern version of the worry. There are two mysteries, both of which have to be considered equally. The mystery of the nature of consciousness and the mystery of the nature of matter. We don't really understand the nature of matter, but also we don't really understand the nature of consciousness and mind. And this leads to, I think, is the core of the problem. I like the way can put it, something unknown is doing we don't know what. This leads to the natural argument for panpsychism. You've probably seen this before. I won't go over the argument. There are lots of benefits to panpsychism, one of my favorite theories. But it also has problems. The first one being, of course, the incredulous stare, right? Colin McGinn called it metaphysically outrageous balderdash, a hippie-ish or stone doctrine, hence the dude's rejoinder. There are more serious downsides. I think it's too deferential to science. I think it does have a problem with mental causation in various ways. Again, I don't have time to go over that. It has an infamous problem of how do you combine the elementary features the panpsychist posits into complex mental states. Nobody knows how that works. There are many interesting possibilities. It's interesting the combination problem here enunciated by Ralph Cudworth in 1678. You might think we could switch to a weaker view, pan-proto-psychism. I think David Chalmers coined that term, where instead of positing psychic elements at the bottom of reality, you posit proto-psychic elements. But no one knows what the proto-psychic elements are. If you leave them unspecified, well, that's just a version of physicalism. Now, the neutral monist approach, or the dual aspect monist approach, says, well, maybe we're giving too much primacy to the mental and the physical. And if we demote them, we will make a better, we can produce a more accurate theory. Now, here, finally, William James developed a theory in the very early 20th century, which he called radical empiricism. He says, I believe that consciousness is the name of a non-entity, a faint rumor left behind by a disappearing soul upon the air of philosophy. Instead, he held, there is only one primal stuff or material in the world out of which everything is composed. We call the stuff, unfortunately, pure experience. Now, whenever I use the phrase pure experience, you have to subtract the mentalistic association with the word experience. James himself wasn't always totally consistent about this, and people have complained that he's trading on this ambiguity sometimes. We're going to try to avoid trading on that kind of ambiguity. James says also about pure experience, we can glimpse it but never grasp it. What we grasp is always some substitute for it, which previous human thinking has peptonized and cooked for our consumption. This is not really quite accurate, as we'll see in a minute, but he is getting at something important. Here's some more James. Now, of course, these pictures are the young James, and the theory is developed much later. But I like them because I think radical empiricism is as cool as the young James. So I like to use them. Pure experience, James says, is the name I give to the immediate flux of life, of that which is not yet any definite what, though it's ready to be all sorts of whats. And if you ask what any bit of pure experience is, it's just what appears. And the instant field of the present is at all times what I call the pure experience. It's only virtually or potentially either object or subject. It's just plain, unqualified actuality. I think James's pure experience is just what is present. And you should think of presence as the primitive notion of radical empiricism. But it's not mysterious. It's fully accessible as what is unquestionably given. Right now, things are present to you. And this is the ground of what I think is the true Cartesian certainty. Not I exist, but something exists. And I think if you thought about illusionism, the end point for illusionism is it's an illusion that anything exists. And I think that really is going too far. Here's a description of presence by a modern philosopher, Caspar Hare. There are some things, seemingly a painting of St. George and the Dragon, a telephone, a diary, a facial itch. Their nature remains obscure. Perhaps the painting is not really a painting. Maybe the telephone is just a toy. Maybe the diary is a bundle of sense data. Maybe the itch is a neural event. All that can be said for sure is that these things, whatever they are, reveal themselves. They are present. Mark Johnson says presence is the variety of ways in which real or ostensible items disclose some aspect of their nature. So things are present. We can all agree. Presence transcends the mental-physical split, and it does so in at least two ways. Mental and physical are equally present. Maybe right now you're looking at the screen and feeling sleepy. Equally present. But the second is presence is never definitively physical or mental. Now, yes, what is present to you right now are ordinary physical objects, but maybe somebody put some LSD in your coffee this morning, and actually you're laying in an alley somewhere just tripping out in this rather distressing experience, right? That would be then a mental, but just as much present, right? That's the Jamesian simple that. Now, when you think about radical empiricism, there's a persistent need to make what I call a stance reversal. So it's very tempting to think of presence as presence to a subject. But please resist that temptation. Subjects are not the source of presence. Presence is the source of subjects. Similarly, objects are not the source of presence. Presence is the source of objects. So we reverse an ordinary way of thinking about this. It's difficult. James himself struggles. But please try. There's another error. It's natural to think of presence as presence to mind. Same problem. It looks like I can change what's present at will. I shut my eyes, you all disappeared, right? But that's also the wrong way to think about it. You have to reverse this ordinary stance. Here, Mark Johnson has a nice quote about this. We are not producers of presence. It is not our mental acts that make things present. We are samplers of presence. Our mental acts are samplings from a vast realm of objective manners of presentation. It is the nature of existence to present. But again, you must perform the reversal. There is no I doing this sampling. The samples are the moments of pure experience that constitute conscious subjects. So you will ask, how do subjects and objects emerge from presence? Well, James has a great answer to this. The one self-identical thing has so many relations to the rest of experience, that is pure experience or presence, that you can take it in disparate systems of associations and treat it as belonging with opposite contexts. In one of these contexts, it's your field of consciousness, but in another, it's the room where you sit. What is this? This is a structuralist theory of the world of objects and subjects. And as we've learned long ago from Eddington and Russell, science only reveals the structure of the world as described more or less abstractly via math and logic. If you think back to the birth of science, Galileo and Descartes, they mathematized nature, and in doing so, they divorced science from pure experience. And that was a great thing to do, right? Modern structural realism can be described like this. Modern structural realism involves a commitment to the claim that science is progressive and cumulative, insofar as it yields structural knowledge. But it departs from standard scientific realism in rejecting that terms are referential. Standard referential semantics is rejected, and any account of approximate truth is also eliminated. And according to modern structural realists, scientific theories don't give us knowledge. Science doesn't give us knowledge of the intrinsic natures of unobservable individual objects. The little diagram on the side is supposed to illustrate structure, and it's an interesting diagram because it's actually a musical composition by Hildur Gunderdottir. The colors represent notes, and the musicians simply choose a path when they play together. If you've ever heard it, it actually comes out sounding pretty good. The structure, though, says nothing about, oh, this is music. This is just abstract structure. The drive towards mathematical structure has led us, as we all know, to two stunningly successful theories, quantum mechanics and general relativity, that happen to be inconsistent with each other. Doesn't matter structurally, they're still revealing the structures. Now, James's view is a structuralism, I think. You do need something to make concrete the structures that science posits. Otherwise, you face really difficult and, I think, intractable problems. But James, of course, has sitting on the table something to form the material out of which structures are made. It's pure experience, or presence. So, and this is a slightly crude representation, but we're presented with a complex revelation of reality, panoply of qualities, but also relations. James was very strong about the idea that we experience, that is, pure experience contains relations. Adjacency, significance, temporality, spatiality. Now, it's those moments that have so many relations to the rest of experience that you can take them in disparate systems of association. One vastly complicated structure forms what we call the physical world. Another, very complicated, defines what we call conscious minds. So your conscious mind is a structure defined over these moments of pure experience. It's happening right now, right, part of your mind. This makes sense of what Johnson says. Again, an important feature. Properly understood, there are no subjective phenomena. Every experience is revelatory of reality. So fundamental reality is present. That's the world of pure experience. And it's here for us, always. But the system of relational structures instantiated by pure experience, we call those the quotidian world, the ordinary world. And it is vital to make or keep in mind this presence quotidian cut. You won't be able to understand radical empiricism without that. The quotidian world is just the ordinary world that as I think I experience it. A world which, as Van Frassen says here, my ancestors of 2 centuries ago couldn't enter, right? They don't have the equipment, the conceptual equipment. Quotidian reality is just the set of patterns defined over presence. These include minds and physical objects, but also tables, stars, animals, everything else. Now, the relational constraints, if you wanted to say, what are the relational constraints binding the identity of these things, this would be extremely hard to spell out. And that's why we have philosophical problems. Very hard. What is the self? What is the nature of space and time? What's the nature of causation? The problem of identity over time? The problem of material composition, which is harder than you might think if you're not a philosopher. We might call the problem of identity over space. These are all really hard problems to solve. That's because the relational constraints over pure experience that instantiate these notions are really complicated. Here's like the core of the quotidian world. You can see, I should say, mind and the physical world. You can see the various features, many more. Talk about some of them, but here's the one that's the most fun. Perceptual experience is constituted by elements of pure experience we call perceptual quality and experience relations. Now, the elements of pure experience are unified presences, right? What is present to you now? Big field, right? It's holistic. It's not constructed out of the elements, but it contains them. This has echoes with the last two talks you will recognize. These things are neutral between the mental and physical. The mental and physical are aspects of the quotidian world, which are patterns of pure experience. Russell said there's only one kind of stuff out of which the world is made. The stuff is called mental in one arrangement, physical in another arrangement. Now, this leads to a really nice consequence, certainly one that James really enjoyed. When I perceive something, my mind and the object are literally identical. It is that piece of pure experience that is the object and my mind. And this means the mind is not representing the world. It's inhabiting the world. That's why I call this talk, it's out there already. The mind is out there already. For perception. What about thinking? Now, if you read James's papers on radical empiricism, this is much more difficult than perception. Perception has that rather beautiful identity of mind and object. Thought, obviously, you have the split between the knower and the known. But James says, okay, let's divide this. He divides it into three, but I'm only considering two here. Okay, you do have perceptual knowledge. That's the very same piece of experience taken twice over. But there's also the possibility two pieces of actual experience belonging to the same subject with tracks of conjunctive transitional experience between them. That is, there's a system, a relational structure that makes elements of pure experience into thought. Now again, you must do the reversal. You shouldn't be thinking the subjects are prior. It's this kind of conjunctive transitions that make a knowing subject, constitute a knowing subject. Now these sequences of mental features could be images, expectancies, frustrations, felt satisfactions. James uses the example of getting from your home to your office. Maybe you don't need to use images. And this is really neat that maybe you don't need images to think, but you do need expectancies, frustrations, and satisfactions. What thought is, for James, is basically a set of expectancies, broadly sensory in character, but including what he called the fringe of consciousness, which are anticipations, expectancies, One that he emphasized, a sense of orientation. Right now, I feel like I know where I am, and that's a really critical part of my cognition. Right? If you lose that, as some people do, it's a neurological syndrome, is to lose orientation. A very disturbing feature. James says a successful thought is one where one's soul is prophetic. That is, one piece of pure experience is kind of maybe a resonant echo of another. James says it's where the sequence of experience includes the sense that nowhere is there a jar, but every later moment continues and corroborates an earlier one. And so I think here's a crow learning to categorize stripes from dots. And the crow, once he's got it right, he's getting this sense of no jar. Yeah, everything's just going along just great, right? Now this leads to a remarkable consequence. The critical role of expectancies and this felt satisfaction and frustration and the elements of the fringe mean that the body is inextricably tied up with perception and cognition. And the linkage is what James called appreciations, appreciational states, which are expectancies, felt satisfactions, felt frustrations. So one aspect of these, which you would guess, that value resides in the world. The sunset is beautiful. The experience of the sunset, who knows? Value is perceived. It's all, in one context, the sunset is beautiful. In another, it's my experience, of course. This means that there's a way to mark out the mind-body link through the emotions. And James, of course, is famous for the James Lang theory of emotions, which suggests it's basically emotions are crudely perceptions of the body. So we have a mind, it's a relational structure of pure experience, M. A body is another kind of system of relations. And what links M and B are these appreciations or felt bodily states. All thinking is an emotionally engaged process. That's the idea. Here James says, one thought in every developed activity series is a desire or thought of purpose, and all the other thoughts acquire a feeling tone from the relation of harmony or oppugnancy to this. Every definite image in the mind, if you are thinking of images, I sometimes wonder if James would hold the view that all thinking is quasi-sensory. And I suspect that that is right for him. Including as the quasi-sensory, these emotional perceptions of the state of the body. So every definite image in the mind is steeped and dyed in the free water that flows around it, the sense of its relations, the significance, the value of the image is all in this halo or penumbra that surrounds and escorts it, or rather that is fused into one with it. Pure experience also contains a palpable sense of activity, maybe what we would call attentiveness, shifting interest, an openness to change. And this is the feeling of will. Right? Or in the quotidian world, what gives rise to the problem of freedom. So will as experience is suffused with its bodily counterpart in its emotional aspect, sustaining, persevering, striving, paying with effort as we go, hanging on and achieving our attention. James says this is action, this is effectuation. I think this makes some sense of an otherwise very cryptic remark of James, where he says, the stream of thinking is only a careless name for what, when scrutinized, reveals itself to consist chiefly in the stream of my breathing. Right? If you think just the feeling of being in your body, but it has this huge fringe of what you expect, hope, which sometimes is fulfilled and sometimes is frustrated. Time and space. Now, I'm running out of time. What we have is pure experience contains temporality, but there is no perception of space itself. As Silberstein says, we do not experience things in time and space. We experience them temporally and spatially. Causation. Pure experience is acausal. Causation is in the quotidian world. So I think that means we should probably think about causation philosophically in terms of the kind of interventionist theory of causation, which means there is no mind-body problem of causation, at least. What is science doing? Science is mapping the set of patterns in the realm of pure experience, very usefully, too. Now, I want to turn in the end to some objections. You probably thought a lot of them already, but it's quite possible they were already thought of long ago, especially by Bertrand Russell, Boyd Henry Boda, and Dickinson Sargent Miller. Boda and Miller, not much remembered anymore. Anyway, let's start with Russell. Here's a quote from James that Russell reacted to. Now, of course, remember, so this is what Russell's writing about 1914 or something like that. He later rejected his rejection and became a Jamesian neutral monist. His own neutral monism is really quite different, but he does credit James with waking him from his dogmatic slumbers. So here's what James says. When we call an experience conscious, that does not mean that it is suffused with a peculiar modality of being, psychic being, as stained glass might be suffused with light, but rather that it stands in certain determinate relations to other portions of pure experience, extraneous to itself. So to get consciousness, conscious mind, you need the system of relations over pure experience, which is meeting the constraints which define what a mind is. So Russell does not like that. And here's his objection. I feel here an insuperable difficulty. I cannot think that the difference between my seeing the patch of red and the patch of red being there unseen consists in the presence or absence of relations between the patch of red and other objects of the same kind. Here, this is such a modern sounding objection. It seems to me possible to imagine a mind existing for only a fraction of a second, seeing the red and ceasing to exist before having any other experience. On such a supposition would be on James' theory not merely improbable, but meaningless. According to him, things become parts of my experience in virtue of certain relations to each other. So yeah, that sounds like a good objection in a way, but I think, well, we can regiment it like this. In radical empiricism, conscious minds are such in virtue of being parts of a relational structure which includes items extraneous to that mind. But it is possible for a conscious mind to exist absolutely alone and momentarily, and therefore radical empiricism is false. Well, I think this argument begs the question against James by ignoring the distinction between what we've been calling moments of pure experience and such a moment, the very same thing, residing in a relational structure constituting a mind. It could be, for example, that this moment of pure experience is part of my mind. Right? Then Russell's momentary mind would just be a part of my mind, and maybe other minds too. It would be what mereologists might call an undetached part or stage of a mind. It's kind of like imagining a node in a network existing alone and calling it a node in a network, right? The node can exist alone, but that doesn't make it a node in a network. I wonder, would there be a problem with, real Boltzmann brains, physical brains created via quantum fluctuation arising in the state my brain is now? Well, I expect the correct physics will reveal Boltzmann brains are impossible. But it is entirely logically possible. But that would just be a rather exotic member of the quotidian world. Studyable. If somebody else happened to be around, maybe two brains appear out of nothing. Here's another Russell objection. In a world where there's no specifically mental facts, it's not plain there would be is it not plain that there would be a complete impartiality or evenly diffused light, not the central illumination fading away into outer darkness that's characteristic of objects in relation to a mind? So maybe we could regiment that as, in radical empiricism, every element of pure experience is both mental and physical, depending on the context. But there are some specifically or singularly mental events, so RE is false. I myself doubt that radical empiricism demands this perfect mirroring. But James seemed to think it was true, that every part of pure experience could be mental in one context and physical in another. But every one of those, that's because every element of pure experience contains interest, attention, value, etc. So the body is going to be there as well. What features of the body? All of them, right down to the uptake of serotonin in the brain and the neural correlates of consciousness. I guess I have a few more minutes. Another objection. Here's another thing James really wanted: communion. When the idea was when two minds are perceiving the same thing, their minds literally overlap. So a very romantic, maybe even erotic notion of shared experience. It's also kind of metaphysically efficient, but it's impossible. This is the objection of Boda. Basically, the objection is James says every state of consciousness is different from every other. So it's completely impossible for there to be two states of consciousness that are identical. So communion of what as he wanted is impossible. Miller took this further. He says James thinks conscious states are entitative. That means every element of them is influenced and depends on every other element in them. It's a rather nice notion of unity of consciousness there. And Miller then says, okay, if holism is true, then no two minds ever experience the same thing, and that means they live in different worlds, and that means radical empiricism implies solipsism. So James struggled against this, and in the pluralistic universe gives up. Returns to panpsychism, rejects his own arguments against mental combination, and rejects standard logic. But we don't have to go there. Radical empiricism, I think, can deal with these problems. Roughly speaking, if you think more about the reversal of stance, an experience of the same is not the same experience. An experience of motion is not an experience in motion. And an experience of spatial extension is not a spatially extended experience. And those can all hold of pure experience. James wanted this picture, right? Two minds, M2 and M1, perceiving the same physical object, sharing one point of pure experience that makes up both minds and the physical object. But I see nothing wrong with the picture on the right. Two minds perceiving the same physical object, but not the very same element of experience. Okay, I'll conclude with the virtues. First of all, radical empiricism solves the hard problem. Everything is made of what it is like stuff. What it is like stuff. It's a mistake to think that matter or mind generates consciousness. So that's good. Radical empiricism puts us in direct contact with fundamental reality. Right now, what is present to you is fundamental reality. It's not the atoms or the quarks. It's just what is present. Mind and world are in essence identical, and in perception, the mind is already out there, in and of the world. So that's nice. It gives science its proper role, not the impossible role of discovering things behind the data, which instead discovering patterns in the data. The patterns are hugely various, very deep, depending on really amazing mathematical structures, but they're the patterns in the data. And last virtue I'll mention, it does not pretend to offer solution to difficult philosophical problems. Skepticism, for example, would remain unsolved. I have access to fundamental reality, but I, from my standpoint, don't know that it fulfills the relational conditions to be a physical world. So all these advantages depend on only one thing. You have to adopt this stance reversal. Accept that you are made of and in contact with pure experience, present to you at every moment. Accept that you're not the controlling factor over presence, rather yourself is a structure of pure experience. And accept that the quotidian world is not fundamental, but is made of the stuff which lies before you always, pure experience. So I thank you.
So in our quotidian world, we are at the end of the session, but maybe we have the possibility to use your presence here for 2 questions,
Okay.
but not more than 2. Please.
Okay, very briefly, on every slide, I thought of Alfred North Whitehead and process and reality. How relevant is that?
It is relevant, but the way I understand Whitehead, he's more of what a panpsychist, constitutive panpsychist. So he seems to think that you can relate elementary physical processes to momentary events which have a kind of psychic quality, right? So little tiny, I forget what is, occasions, right? The occasions, and they are mental, but they also, you know, a transition in an electron would be one of them, right? James, the pure experience doesn't go down to the electron, right? It's at the surface. But it is, the moments of pure experience could be called Whiteheadian occasions, but not mirroring the kind of structure that science is revealing of the microworld.
Yeah. There's a lot I like about this view, and especially the slide that was up before your talk started. It's already out there. But, you know, I look, let's say, at that red part of what's behind you, and I think of it as yes, it's part of me, and it's part of the screen, right? But then I think of what science has told us since Galileo, that actually, if we, you know, investigate the screen, it's a bunch of molecules in motion. And that's it, right? There's nothing like what I think is in my experience actually in the physical series.
Yes.
If I've made that clear, you know, so I mean, it seems like there's a kind of a contradiction brewing.
Not a contradiction, scientific anti-realism. So the view that goes with radical empiricism, I think, is something like a Van Frasian constructive realism. So the molecules are just a way of modeling patterns in pure experience. That's all. Right? Go ahead, pick one up, show it to me. No, can't do it. Right? I think, so that's right. So I have to deny your premise that science has revealed. Right?
Okay, so let's thank the speaker once more.
All the speakers.